and thank you for joining us for this dissertation presentation. As you can see, the title is Should I Stay or Should I Go? And I chose this title to reflect the overall topic of my research, which is about teacher dropouts, specifically ESL teachers in Quebec, and what we can do in teacher education to help solve the problem before it starts. So here's an overview of what I'm going to talk about for the next 20 minutes. For this presentation, I was asked to focus on the key contributions my research is making to my field. So as I move through the presentation, introducing the problem, covering my methodology and my findings, I'll pause and indicate where I believe I have contributed something new to the field. In my conclusion, I'll suggest some ways that teacher education programs can help address the problem of teacher attrition. So here's a brief overview of 4 ways I believe my research has contributed to my field. The first is methodological. I describe a method I designed called story circles as a way of collecting narrative data. The second was theoretical. I propose an extension to current theories of efficacy, describing how it can be co-constructed in peer groups. Third was conceptual. I proposed a construct that describes an inverse relationship between power and acceptance of feedback. And the final way I contributed was also conceptual. I identified 7 key experiences that can help or hinder future teachers build both efficacy and professional teacher identity. So to begin, this research began in my growing awareness of a shortage of teachers worldwide. Now, it's not just that fewer teachers are entering the profession, it's that more teachers are leaving it too early. And the problem is particularly acute for ESL and FSL teachers in Canada. In fact, in the French and Collins study, which was published in 2011, nearly half of all Quebec ESL teachers reported considering leaving their profession in the past year. Now, this statistic is bad enough, but it's worse when you can compare it to the overall average for FSL teachers, French second language teachers, in the rest of Canada. So there's evidently a problem with retaining English second language teachers in Quebec. My next step was to find out what the problem was. So this was the question that began my research. What is it about the situation for English second language teachers in Quebec that makes them more likely to drop out than other teachers in other contexts? What I found in my literature review is that there are a number of extrinsic, contextual factors that will cause teachers to drop out, including workload, conflict, and classroom management issues. Many researchers, however, are also looking at intrinsic factors. And this is when I came across the theory of self-efficacy as a possible way of understanding who stays and who leaves. So what is teacher self-efficacy? This is a theory that is defined by Woolfolk, Rossoff, and Hoy as a teacher's belief that they can have a positive effect on student learning. Pay attention to the word belief, that will be important. As I went through the literature, I realized that not only were attrition and efficacy connected, but teacher identity and teacher education were also integral parts of the same puzzle. So this is what I found. First, research by both Swanson and Hong found that efficacy and attrition were inversely correlated. So the higher the efficacy score, the less likely the teacher was to consider leaving. And this makes sense because as a teacher, if you believe you have power to change students or help them learn, then you're more likely to stay than someone who has had the feeling that they have no effect on their students. Second, identity and efficacy theories overlap conceptually, because efficacy is not necessarily related to a teacher's actual ability, but is rather a reflection of the person's belief in their ability. In other words, teachers perform their identity, their teacher identity in the classroom, and the identity they're performing, the act they put on as teacher, largely depends on what they think it means to be a good teacher or a not so great teacher. In other words, how well do they measure up to their own ideas of what it means to be a good teacher? And this brings me to teacher education. I argue in my dissertation that teacher education is an ideal place to investigate the connections between efficacy, identity, and attrition. First, because according to most efficacy theory, efficacy beliefs are most pliable early in learning, but also because once they're out in the field, it's very difficult to solve those contextual problems that future teachers will face. I argue that if we want to help future teachers be more resilient, one of the best places we can begin is by helping them build strong efficacy and a robust identity before they enter the field. In other words, while they're still in teacher education programs. Okay, so let's look at the methods that I used to investigate this problem. I decided on a mixed methods approach, first because I felt each question was best addressed by methods from either a quantitative or qualitative paradigm, but also because I intended to mix the methods. For example, I used the descriptive statistics from the online survey to write some of the questions for the qualitative data collection. I also used information from the first survey about age, gender, linguistic identity, and efficacy scores to selectively recruit participants for the qualitative phase of research. So here's a visual diagram of my research design. In phase 1 and 3, here, I used an online survey. I asked my participants to complete the online survey to measure their efficacy scores before and after their major field placement. So at the end of their second year of university and at the start of their third when they're doing this major practicum. In phase 2, qualitative here, I used a form of narrative inquiry to collect anecdotes from the participants during the practicum experience. So in this design, I was able to look at efficacy and identity experiences before the practicum, during the practicum, and after, before, during, and after. And this brings me to my first contribution. In the qualitative phase, I really wanted to gather narrative data to see how the participants were making sense of their own experiences while on practicum. So to do this, I designed a variation on the focus group format and created a setting where small groups of participants were asked questions designed to provoke narratives. These I called story circles. And the story circles method was very efficient. I managed to collect over 200 anecdotes from my participants in about 6 hours. I'm hoping that this new hybrid method I've proposed will interest other researchers as a way of collecting narrative data. I also found that this new method led to an unexpected discovery. And this is my second contribution. As I read through the transcripts of the story circles, I noticed a general pattern emerged. As one participant told a story of success, others chimed in with their own success stories, both of challenges and successes. So these stories seemed to increase the whole group's sense of efficacy, kind of in the fashion of a bricklayer. Each story built on the next, cementing together group feelings of efficacy through shared experiences. The peer interaction, and I've got an example here, in this kind of professional learning community provided a place for the students to build efficacy in what I call future imagined moments of success. So the second contribution I believe I've made then is a contribution towards efficacy theory, more specifically in understanding how teachers can build efficacy collaboratively in these kind of peer groups. All right, there were 4 key findings from my research. Each was framed in answer to one of the research questions. The first finding was that changes in efficacy occurred during teacher education in the presence of actual students. But the data also revealed that these increases were the result of a specific process. First, the future teacher needed to watch a mentor model teaching strategies effectively. This is what, according to Bandura, who wrote the first theory of efficacy, is a vicarious experience of efficacy. Next, the teacher needs to try out strategies. And this is what's really important. They not only need to try new strategies, they need to be in an environment where they can take risks on these strategies without fearing failure. We'll get to that in a second and why that's important. Without taking the risks, they can't reflect. They can't figure out what works and what doesn't, and why some strategies work and others don't. Once they've reflected on what works and what doesn't, they can consolidate their learning and start to use the most effective strategies in teaching. Using the most effective teaching strategies leads to mastery experiences, which are the ultimate source of efficacy building. And cumulative mastery experiences, in turn, lead to overall increases in teacher self-efficacy. The second key finding was that there were some opportunities for building teacher efficacy and identity during teacher education classes. And these opportunities happened most often when teachers modeled techniques and the students were allowed to try them out too. Unfortunately, the qualitative data showed that all my participants believed that overall opportunities were infrequent, ineffective, and inconsistent. The third key finding was that the way we evaluate students during the practicum actually prevents them from doing a number of important things. First, it prevents them from accepting constructive feedback from the teacher mentors. In fact, anyone who's being evaluated getting constructive feedback, it often creates active resentment. Here's an example from the transcripts. Second, it prevents future teachers from building efficacy effectively. And this is because being placed in a situation where you're being constantly evaluated creates a space where you fear failure. It inhibits opportunities for the kind of risk-taking I talked about earlier. This is the process of trial, error, and reflection that's needed to have mastery experiences, which in turn builds overall efficacy. Finally, being evaluated prevents future teachers from constructing their teacher identity effectively. And this is because it encourages a climate where future teachers perform to please, rather than actually performing their identity in authentic ways. Perhaps unsurprisingly then, a key condition for successful efficacy and identity building was to be given the space to teach alone and unobserved. In other words, teaching in a space without evaluation, where student teachers felt free to make mistakes without any judgment. Thinking about the way we evaluate student teachers in the field and its effect on feedback led to what I believe is my third contribution to the field. The construct I propose to illustrate the way that a hierarchy of power works to inhibit student teachers' acceptance of feedback. So in this model, the greater the power the person giving feedback has over the person accepting the feedback, the less likely they were to accept the suggestions, and the more likely they were to resent it. The final key finding from my research was about the factors that appeared to increase the potential for attrition or resilience. My research confirmed findings in other studies that stressors leading to potential attrition included workload and negative feedback, but I also found hostility towards ESL teachers in the teaching community was a factor. My data also showed that pre-service teachers built resilience through peer support, connection to students, acts of defiance, and experiences teaching outside the teacher education program. Here are a few quotes from the transcripts. This one talks about peers. Here's what I call an act of defiance. And this one is connection to students. Finally, here's a quote that illustrates the power that teaching alone outside education has over attrition and resilience. So the final contribution I believe I've made to my field is in identifying 7 key experiences over the course of a future teacher's path that currently help or hinder efficacy and identity construction. My hope is that by understanding a little better when and how efficacy and identity construction occur, that we can build on our strengths and adjust areas of concern. So here are the 7 moments I've identified. And the first is early formative experiences before entering teacher education, being in the teacher education program, observing on placement, teaching under observation, getting feedback and evaluation, teaching unobserved during the practicum, and teaching unobserved outside teacher education. Which brings us to my conclusion. I believe that the findings of this research will help teacher educators, help future language teachers develop strong efficacy and identity, thereby hopefully preventing future ESL teacher dropouts. I've compiled these recommendations, I've compiled these findings into 3 recommendations for language teacher education programs. So the first is really to revisit past research. When I did my literature review, I saw that there is already a wealth of research from previous educational researchers such as Darling Hammond. And these researchers have excellent suggestions for specific and concrete ways teacher education programs can address several of the ongoing issues with things like evaluation, mentorship, and the practicum structure that I identified in my research. So a good place to start would be by revisiting these recommendations and starting to put them into practice. The second way we can address issues of attrition and resilience is by building on what we already do well in teacher education programs. For example, we can encourage construction of peer networks and professional learning communities. And we can also strengthen teacher modeling of effective teaching strategies, particularly by moving away from lecture-style classes in education towards ones with more cooperative learning. And this is so that future teachers have a model of what to do and also a recent experience of how effective it is. Kind of break the cycle of being lectured to and in turn lectured to other people. Finally, we can consider opportunities for the future. For example, by taking a good hard look at the way we structure evaluation and the practicum experience, and by creating conditions for constructive dialogue and feedback in the practicum, the kind that encourages growth rather than inhibits it. Finally, I'd like to take a moment to thank some of the numerous people who supported me intellectually, emotionally, and financially through this process. There are too many to be named on one slide alone, but here are some of the key players. I couldn't have done this without you. Thank you.